Hello and welcome to another swear-laden, alcohol-raging, and squirrel-butt-shaking episode of What Happened, the show that reaches into the mountains of muck to pull out the wildest stories from deep within the gaming industry.
This is gonna be interesting.
You probably already noticed from the title and/or thumbnail, but this week's episode is all about a game from the legendary studio known as Rare. Again! Despite having a legion of old-school fans and an incredible back catalog, Rare are no stranger to our stage, and I wouldn't have it any other way. The Rare of old exemplified one of the best types of studio in my book, one that took creative risks left and right and just made what they wanted to make. And there's no better evidence of that than a game about a hungover, foul-mouthed British woodland creature who stumbles into becoming a god emperor whilst lampooning The Matrix, Clockwork Orange, and Saving Private Ryan.
This is crazy!
The game is a veritable drunken dream, somehow simultaneously managing all of its quirks while being both a technical showpiece and a downright fun time to boot. However, the road to Conker finally conquering development hell wasn't an easy one. It took almost 5 years, a near cancellation, and a full reboot to get there, so it all very much begs the question, what happened to Conker's Bad Fur Day?
It's gonna be one of those days.
It was 1996, and the
Nintendo Ultra 64
had just made a pretty respectable splash at retail, primarily driven by the breakthrough that was Super Mario 64. You might have heard of it. Rare had been working with Nintendo at that time, pumping out various titles like Blast Corps, GoldenEye, and Killer Instinct Gold, but once Mario butt-slammed his way into the marketplace, it sent ripples throughout the gaming industry at large, providing a handy guide on how to nail platformers in full 3D. The team that had just finished KI Gold took notice of the plumber's blockbuster success and started working on their own 3D platformer. This is funny because despite Rare eventually shipping tons of said 3D platformers, Conker's Quest was actually their first go at it, and ironically, their last on the Nintendo 64. As stated in my Donkey Kong video, Rare's 4th DK game actually started life as a 2.5D platformer, while their other big project was still stuck in its awkward teenage RPG phase, where it was known as Project Dream, headlined by this Sudeki-looking Dorcas right here. During the beginning of production, Rare co-founder Tim, I refuse to leak KI2's SNES build Stamper, had apparently suggested to the KI team that their 3D platformer should star a cutesy main character in order to help the game cast a wider net, and also presumably so Rare could have a new mascot to call their own. With that in mind, the team set about constructing colorful environments and getting a squirrel they named Conker running around in them fairly quickly. According to an article in Unseen 64, the studio's teams were, at that time, kept pretty separate from one another, which in part instilled a certain, quote, healthy rivalry between each team, according to ex-Rare staffer Steve Males. They tended to not be fully aware of each other's projects, and according to a Conkers BFD Let's Play hosted by Chris Seavor, once the Project Dream staff saw an early version of Conker, they decided to scrap everything they were doing and to start their own 3D platformer, with a bear and bird in the title role. This will be very important later. At E3 1997, Nintendo publicly unveiled both games as Conker's Quest and Banjo-Kazooie, with the press noting some rather big similarities between the two. Chris Seavor, who started as an artist on Conker, echoed those statements in issue 174 of Retro Gamer magazine. The Donkey Kong lot were the Golden Boys, and I don't think much was expected of the outcasts in the other barn. I'm being facetious, of course, but it serves to illustrate the state of play at that moment. Conker, even though it was more similar to Mario 64 in terms of tone than cancelled Rare RPG Project Dream initially, was the one that had to change after Banjo-Kazooie became a thing. Having two cutesy first-party 3D platformers coming out at the same time on the same console was questionable, but from the same studio wasn't an option. Banjo was Tim Stamper's baby. Anyway, Conker's gameplay continued to take shape, with the team giving him a girlfriend character by the name of Barry who could help traverse the game's levels, collect nuts, and a bunch of other bog-standard platformer activities. Despite these additions, every time it was shown to the press, the general consensus continued to be that Banjo was the heavy favorite. Outlets like N64.com felt that Banjo's camera control was more fluid, with Ultra Game players saying that Conker's overly cutesy aesthetic was borderline disturbing. The friendly competition between the two would continue later that same year, when both mascots popped up in Diddy Kong Racing towards the end of 1997, only to be destroyed by the all-encompassing savage god beast energy that is Timber. Actually, going back to DKR today, though, might be kinda weird for some people. While Banjo is his same lovable self,
I'm Banjo!
Conker is a gormless, smiley thumbs-upper, something that absolutely needed to change if he was going to continue to exist. In 1998, Rare decided that, among other things, a name change was in order for the project. Conker's Quest wasn't exactly the most glitzy moniker, so it was renamed to 12 Tails Conkers 64. The team also felt that adding a multiplayer suite with both competitive and cooperative modes would help differentiate it from Banjo, which only offered a single-player experience. Speaking of single-player, more elements were being added to Conker, including Barry being able to hop on a dinosaur buddy to take out enemies. All these changes and additions also resulted in delays, so while the Banjo team started to approach the finish line, the Conker team conversely started losing confidence in their game and its continued identity crisis. Meanwhile, a deluge of colorful mascot platformers began jumping and/or bopping onto the N64, headlined by such luminaries as Chameleon Twist, Glover, and the other ones. So by this point, Conker was going to be late to the party no matter how they tackled it, putting the team in quite the pickle. Canceling or rebooting it into another genre wasn't really an option, as the Stampers had been so gung-ho about Conker's potential that they had also greenlit a GBC title, Conker's Pocket Tales, which had been going smoothly. Thus, the team continued to plug away in somewhat of a funk, not really knowing what to do next, which only resulted in more delays. Rare artist and character designer Don Murphy went on record with Emily Rogers in 2012, saying bluntly, 12 Tails, to put it politely, was not a good game. Software engineer Chris Marlowe also shared that sentiment during an interview in the Rare Replay supplemental materials, with, "There was an awful lot of content and there were lots of fun ideas, but it just really wasn't gelling as a finished game." With the team floundering and Banjo-Kazooie becoming Rare's big 1998 smash success, the threat of cancellation was starting to look like a very real possibility. They either needed to come up with a solution or throw everything in the bin and move on to something else. So, in early 1999, Chris Seavord took the initiative and brought an idea to the Stampers in a bid to save Conker's life, which was, instead of having him collecting nuts, wearing hats, and smiling, he would swear, drink, and, unbeknownst to them at the time, fight literal piles of shit. In his own words, the initial idea was a simple one. Conker is an innocent who wanders into difficult situations and inadvertently causes even more mayhem, before wandering off, not looking back. Conker genuinely wants to help people, but doesn't quite manage it. I thought that would be funny. It sort of evolved from there, really. As Tolkien once said, the tale grew in the telling, or in other words, I made the fucker up as I went along. You try doing that now in the industry, bugger me, the planners would have an epileptic aneurysm. The response from the Stampers to all of this was along the lines of, I love it! The new direction was genuinely bold and fresh, emphasizing narrative and humor over collecting scores of boobly-wooblies or whatever it is that the British love to collect. With the Stampers' green light and a promotion for Chris to project leader, development on Conker was restarted, although obviously they had a decent amount of existing assets and technology at their disposal. Many new characters were created during this process, while others got some pretty drastic makeovers. Cut to a comparison pic of Barry right now. Conker, in a rather odd but brilliant move, not only stayed the same, but got even cuter. In that same issue of Retro Gamer I mentioned earlier, Chris explained this decision. That was one of the few things that carried over from 12 Tales, where the squirreliness of Conker had more relevance. Indeed, his initial movement style was on 4 legs, jumping from point to point very much like his real-world counterpart. Generally though, it's as good a cutesy character as any. In fact, if you looked at the character design from 12 Tales, he became a lot more cutesy in Bad Fur Day, which juxtaposed nicely with the actual tone of the game. This restarting of development was obviously unknown to the general public, but by late 1999, questions from both the media and fans were becoming more and more insistent, asking, "Hey, whatever happened to Conker 64? Is he cancelled?" Well, not the character himself. Well, nowadays Conker would be, but was his video game cancelled? It got to the point where Rare had to say something, and in this case, it was on their official FAQ page. No, it hasn't. It's still being worked on by a full team and with the same level of dedication as when it was first announced. And that wasn't a lie. The change in direction completely reinvigorated the team, with everyone wanting to get in on the joke, as it were, contributing more gags, characters, and punchlines to the insane world Chris had created. So while things creatively were starting to fire on all cylinders, there was just one tiny thing left to take care of, which was telling Nintendo that they were now publishing a game that had sunflowers with massive yabos. Despite my earlier foreshadowing, guess what? Nintendo were actually all like, okay, if you're sure. When informed that Conker would now be targeting a mature rating, complete with blood, alcohol, and tons of swearing. Again, Rare's games, along with Nintendo's own, were the platinum sellers on the N64, so there was very little pushback from Nintendo except for 2 specific references that they asked to be removed. For those of you that are morbidly curious, the offending jokes were a reference to Pokemon, and on the polar opposite end of the spectrum,
Ku Klux Klan.
Aside from that, Chris said that 99.9% of all the edgy material they had wanted to include made it into the final game. With the creative juices cooking, development finally started to go smoothly. Pop culture references were sprinkled liberally throughout the game, forming the backbone of many of Conker's most iconic sequences, with the Saving Private Ryan one being a standout. In Retro Gamer, Chris admitted that the amount of work that went into that whole set piece was a game's worth in itself. It was decided that the camera system should also be more cinematic, since the gameplay was starting to revolve more on contextual interactions rather than platforming, so the team took inspiration from an unlikely source. Prince of Persia 3D was cited as an example of the type of camera angles that the Conker team wanted to implement, but thankfully, they did so to a much more successful degree. In terms of graphics, Rare engineers supposedly spent at least 6 weeks rewriting and optimizing Nintendo's provided microcode, which only featured comments in Japanese in order to support more advanced lighting and audio capabilities. All character interactions in Conker were also fully voiced, so it became one of the very few N64 games to ship on a 64MB cart, alongside other monster whoppers like Resident Evil 2. Even with that, the team ultimately couldn't cram absolutely everything in, as there was still around 20% more content that they had planned but weren't able to finish, including lengthier sections involving Hell and Greg, the boss fight with the bull being even more extensive, I can't imagine that, and the windmill containing several additional characters and storyline sequences. In Chris's own words that he shared with Retro Gamer, time was, and is, always the great enemy.
Where'd you get that from, a fortune cookie?
Then, after a tremendously long-winded development, Conker's Bad Fur Day was set to be unleashed on the gaming world in March 2001, just months away from the GameCube's debut later that year. The launch of their new console was obviously where most of Nintendo's attention was, so when they decided to publish Conker— wait, no, they didn't publish Conker, what? Wait, is this a Mandela effect thing? I'm aware that the European publishing rights were snapped up by THQ, but the North American version was self-published by Rare. Bizarre. I guess Nintendo didn't want any of that smoke, which might explain why they decided against using any of their regular marketing avenues, chiefly Nintendo Power, which just stopped mentioning Conker the second the potty humor started to bubble up from the toilet. They just straight up ghosted it. This meant that gamers who used NP as their main source of information for upcoming releases might not even know Conker had come out. Subscriber counts for NP aren't widely available, but based on the little data that's out there, they likely had a readership in the hundreds of thousands around that time frame. It was an important arm of Nintendo's marketing strategy, so a major game getting skipped entirely wasn't really going to help matters. While Nintendo had their name taken off the box, marketing was still handled and funded by them. A company by the name of Starcom did the actual dirty work. They held promotions and events in college campuses, bars, as well as late-night TV and even adult magazines. But nowhere else. Not on websites, Saturday morning cartoon blocks, or even in comic books. This was obviously because Nintendo wasn't comfortable with promoting such quote-unquote mature content, and unfortunately their worries weren't entirely unfounded. KB Toys refused to stock it. Newspapers like the Los Angeles Times wrote up stories about how the once pure, chaste Nintendo had suddenly decided to peddle smut to minors. They even got quotes from a mom in Indiana who said, after buying the M-rated game for her 15-year-old, "This is disgusting sophomoric humor, and I'm disappointed in Nintendo. It's like Disney releasing pornography." The obvious problem with this marketing approach for an upcoming Nintendo game was that it was aimed at a very specific demographic that probably wasn't interested in Nintendo games, given the meteoric rise of the PlayStation brand. Why buy the erotic squirrel poo game when Red Faction 2, Twisted Metal Black, and Final Fantasy X were on the horizon? Unfortunately, and this shouldn't surprise anyone, Conker's Bad Fur Day Jaeger-bombed at retail. Information leaked to IGN back in the day points at the game moving less than 55,000 copies in North America during its first month, with the leaked figures specifying that the game was doing worse and worse as time went on. This is the old proverbial shame, as the gaming media heaped tons of praise on Rare's wild and weird gamble. It landed incredibly high review scores across the board, and without a doubt lived up to Rare's already very lofty standards. This was the freshest, most unique thing they'd released in years, breaking away from the collectathon conveyor belt the studio had gradually become, and delivering a truly creative vision. Despite the disastrous sales, the Conker team briefly worked on a sequel, Conker's Other Bad Day, which would have directly followed up from the original's ending. This was unfortunately happening right in the middle of Rare's ownership switching hands, with Microsoft rejecting the continued development of Other Bad Day once the Conker ball had bounced into their court. Eventually, a remake with expanded online multiplayer was released right at the tail end of the Xbox's life, so Conker Live and Reloaded achieved better, but still fairly flaccid sales. According to NPD Group, it sold around 150,000 units in its launch month, which, while not dreadful, was still not the type of sales that you'd hope for from a big exclusive. Chris then pitched another sequel, this time trying to appeal to Microsoft's penchant for pushing games with Xbox Live functionality, with Conker Gettin Medieval, which was set to dispense with the single-player story altogether and go all in on the well-received multiplayer aspects seen in Live and Reloaded. If I'm sounding like a broken record here, I apologize, but Microsoft also rejected this pitch. Then, after completing work on 2010's Kinect Sports, Chris Seavor decided to move on, quitting Rare after over 15 years at the studio. Conker wasn't so lucky, remaining locked within the Microsoft vaults with no chance of escape. Kinda. In 2014, fans around the world rejoiced to see the jumped-up little bugger return in Project Spark. I wasn't even aware of this, but apparently the first content pack that featured a new story, which was a canon follow-up to Bad Fur Day dubbed Conker's Big Reunion, actually came out. Well, part of it. It was meant to follow an episodic model, and although the first one did make it out, the following episodes weren't so lucky, which was just oh-so 2015 era Microsoft. Chris Seavor even came back to voice Little Guy before it all went ass up, so it was a shame it ended so abruptly. And the less said about Conker's weird HoloLens appearance, the better. Except that you can actually still play it, but that might be something for Uncle Derek to fart around with, if he can afford it. Eventually, a bone was thrown to Conker fans in the form of Rare Replay, one of the best collections ever released, as it contains the original N64 version of Bad Fur Day, fully playable and shinier than ever on modern Xboxes. Chris would go on to an independent career with his own startup, Gory Detail, with his last project being the odd but charming The Unlikely Legend of Rusty Pup. As is tradition, I'll summarize this episode in the same way I end a lot of Rare Focus videos. They made a super cool thing once, some wacky stuff happened, Microsoft proceeded to do the bare minimum with said cool thing, which has now resulted in long periods of absolutely nothing. In 2023, this is now a very sobering reminder that Conker's Bad Fur Day has been stretched into some bad fur years.
Well, so ends another incident in my day.
Thanks goes out to Daily Kong for her help with this video. And if you know of any other squirrely developments in the video game or movie industries, let me know in the comments below or over on my Twitter. See you next time, and thanks for watching!